Before we begin, if you've ever been treated like you didn't belong in your own family, this story will stay with you long after it ends. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the very ones standing on ground that only exists because of your sacrifices. My name is Isabel Carter, and I'm 31 years old. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, wrapping my hands around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, when my mother walked in and changed the course of my life forever. She didn't bother knocking. That was one of the first lessons I learned growing up in that house. Privacy wasn't something you were allowed to have, not your room, not your thoughts, not even the emotions you kept buried inside your own heart. She slowly pulled out the chair across from me and sat down with calm, deliberate movements, the kind that told me she'd rehearsed every word she was about to say. Folding her hands neatly on the table, she looked less like a mother and more like someone preparing to negotiate a business deal. "Your brother is moving back in with his 2 children," she said evenly. "That means you'll have to leave." She paused only long enough for the words to sink in before adding with complete indifference. "You're a parasite, Isabel. You always have been." I simply stared at her. The coffee in my mug had stopped steaming. Somewhere behind me, the refrigerator hummed softly. Every tiny sound inside that kitchen suddenly became painfully clear, except the one I desperately wanted to hear, the sound that would tell me she was joking. "You're joking, right?" I asked quietly. Even before the question left my lips, I already knew the answer. My mother never joked when her own comfort or my brother's convenience was involved. She let out a short, cold laugh. There was no warmth in it. No awkwardness. Just a sharp sound that dismissed my feelings before I had even finished speaking. "No," she replied. "I'm completely serious. You have 1 week." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. Without saying another word, I stood up, left the untouched coffee behind, walked to my bedroom, reached into the closet, and pulled down my old suitcase. I folded my clothes with mechanical precision, the kind of numb focus people develop when they're trying desperately not to collapse under emotions too heavy to carry. I never cried. The truth was, I had stopped arguing with my mother years earlier. Around the age of 24, I finally realized something painful. Even when I won an argument, I still walked away feeling like I had lost a piece of myself. After zipping the suitcase closed, I carried it to the front door. My father sat in the living room, quietly watching television. He never looked up. That silence answered more than any words ever could. What neither of them knew, what they had never cared enough to discover, was that the very house my mother had just thrown me out of, wasn't actually theirs anymore. It was mine. Every wall. Every beam. Every brick. Every single inch of that property legally belonged to me. It had belonged to me for the past 3 years. But to understand how everything reached that point, I have to take you back to where it truly began. Because the cruelty my mother showed me that morning wasn't created overnight. It had been growing for years. Its roots reached deep into my childhood. I grew up as the invisible child in a family where everything revolved around my older brother, Callum. Callum was 5 years older than me. He was loud, confident, charming, the kind of person adults admired without ever looking closely enough to notice his flaws. From a very young age, I understood exactly what favoritism looked like. And I also understood which side of it I lived on. My parents paid every penny of Callum's college education. For mine, they contributed absolutely nothing. I worked 2 jobs while attending university full-time, took out student loans, earned my finance degree, and carried with me a relentless determination that only comes from spending your entire life being told you're somehow worth less than your own sibling. After graduating, I moved back home. At least, that was supposed to be temporary. I planned to save money, find an apartment, and move out as quickly as possible. But temporary slowly became 2 years. Then 3. Somewhere during that time, my parents stopped treating me like family and started treating me like a piece of furniture they barely noticed anymore. Every rent payment I handed over disappeared without a single word of appreciation. Every grocery trip quietly filled the refrigerator for everyone else. Whenever something around the house broke, I paid to fix it. When my father's pension wasn't enough to cover expenses, I quietly stepped in. One year, I even paid the property taxes because they simply couldn't afford them. None of those sacrifices ever counted in the invisible record my mother kept of my value. The only thing that seemed to matter was Callum's latest crisis. Callum had gone through a divorce. Callum had 2 young children. Callum needed more space. And according to my mother, that automatically meant I had to disappear. What she didn't know was that 2 years before she forced me out, my father had come to me in private during one of the few moments I'd ever seen genuine fear in his eyes. He confessed that the house was about to be lost. Years earlier, he had taken out a second mortgage. The debt had spiraled out of control, and the bank was preparing to foreclose. He was deeply ashamed. More than anything, he didn't want my mother finding out just how serious their financial situation had become. Quietly, he asked me if there was anything I could do. By then, I had already spent 6 years building a successful career in finance. I knew exactly how to handle the situation. I negotiated directly with the bank. I restructured the debt. Then I used the savings I had built through years of relentless discipline and sacrifice to pay the remaining balance in full. In return, my father legally transferred ownership of the house to me. There was nothing secretive about it. The paperwork was straightforward. Everything was documented properly. My name was placed on the deed. His name was removed. My mother never once asked to see those documents. It never crossed her mind that ownership could have changed because she had spent more than 30 years believing everything around her automatically belonged to her. That belief was about to become the biggest mistake of her life. The following morning, just after 5 o'clock, my phone began ringing over and over again. I was lying awake in a cheap hotel less than 2 miles from the house, staring at an ugly water stain spreading across the ceiling while my father's name flashed across my screen again, and again, and again. 7 missed calls in barely 4 minutes. I finally answered the 8th. The man speaking on the other end sounded nothing like the father who had silently watched television while I carried my suitcase out the front door the night before. His voice trembled. "Isabel," he said, barely able to get the words out. "Your mother found the deed." The version of my father I heard on the phone was nothing like the quiet man who had sat in front of the television while I walked out of the house the night before. Back then, he had looked defeated, like someone who had spent years letting the loudest voice in the room make every decision. But now, his voice trembled with panic. "Your mother was looking for the insurance papers," he said. "She opened the filing cabinet and found the property documents. Isabel, she doesn't understand. She keeps saying there has to be some mistake. She says your name shouldn't be on the deed." I let him finish without interrupting. Then I answered as calmly as I could. "It's not a mistake, Dad. And you know it isn't." The silence that followed lasted so long that I glanced at my phone, wondering if the call had disconnected. About 20 minutes later, my mother called. If my father had sounded frightened, my mother sounded furious. She had already moved past disbelief and settled into pure anger, the place she always ran to whenever reality refused to match the version she wanted. She insisted there had been some kind of clerical error. She accused me of taking advantage of my father while he was vulnerable. Then, without hesitation, she called me a parasite once again. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't interrupt. After 31 years, I knew exactly how my mother's outbursts worked. Eventually, every storm reached the same point where certainty began to crack. So I waited. Finally, she paused to catch her breath. "The house belongs to me, Mom," I said quietly. "It has for the past 2 years. Dad came to me because the bank was only months away from taking it. I paid every remaining debt. The title is legally in my name, and I have every document to prove it. This isn't a misunderstanding, and it's not something that's open for debate." Another long silence filled the line. This time, it lasted even longer. For the first time in my life, my mother had no immediate answer. The next 72 hours unfolded in ways I had imagined many times but never truly believed would happen. My mother called my aunt. My aunt contacted my father's brother. Then one relative after another began calling me, each trying to convince me that family property was a delicate issue and that I should be willing to compromise. I listened respectfully to every single one of them. Each time, I explained the exact same facts. The house had been only 2 months away from foreclosure. My parents had hidden the situation from everyone. I stepped in with my own savings. Everything had been done legally. Every document had been signed properly. There was nothing to negotiate because no one had done anything wrong except ignore the truth until it became impossible to deny. Callum finally called on the second day. Unlike everyone else, he believed his charm would work. It usually did. He began by sounding sympathetic. "I'm sorry Mom said those things," he told me. "She was too harsh. Calling you a parasite crossed the line." "I agree," I replied. Then, just as I expected, the conversation shifted. He started talking about his divorce. His children. How badly they needed stability. And finally, he reached the point he had been working toward all along. "Maybe you could let us stay there for a while," he suggested. "You're single, you have a great job, and finding another place would be much easier for you than it would be for me." I waited until he finished. Then I spoke carefully. "Callum, you're asking me to leave my own house so you can move into it." I paused. "I want you to actually hear what you just said." For the first time during the conversation, he had no answer. It struck me then that no one in my family had ever been forced to truly listen to their own words before. On the 4th day, I went back to the house. Not to argue. Not to prove a point. I returned because it was my home, and I was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. My mother was standing in the kitchen when I walked through the door. She looked noticeably smaller than she had only a few days earlier. Sometimes people seem to shrink when the beliefs they've relied on for decades suddenly collapse beneath them. My father was sitting quietly at the table. Neither of them spoke. So I broke the silence. "I didn't come here to throw either of you out," I said. "I won't treat you the way I've been treated." I looked at both of them before continuing. "Callum is welcome to visit with his children whenever he wants. But he will not be moving into this house." I took a slow breath. From this moment forward, the decision about who lives here belongs to me. My mother began crying. I'd seen her cry many times before. Usually, her tears were used to end difficult conversations or shift the blame onto someone else. This was different. These tears felt genuine. For the first time, I wasn't looking at the woman who had controlled our family for decades. I was looking at someone whose entire view of the world had quietly fallen apart. The daughter she had dismissed as worthless. The daughter she had repeatedly called a parasite. She was the one who now legally owned the roof over all of our heads. I wish I could say I felt victorious. But I didn't. Mostly, I felt exhausted. There was sadness too. Years of hurt don't disappear simply because the truth finally comes out. Yet beneath all of that was another feeling. One I hadn't experienced before. It was steady. Peaceful. Certain. For the first time in my life, I was standing on ground that truly belonged to me. I told my parents there were only two conditions if we were going to move forward together. "The first is simple," I said. "I never want to hear the word parasite directed at me again." They both remained silent. "The second is that I want both of you to acknowledge every contribution I've made to this family over the years. I'm not asking for reimbursement. I don't want the money back. I only want the truth to be spoken out loud." My father agreed immediately. My mother needed 3 days before she found the strength to do the same. Eventually, she admitted everything. Callum rented an apartment for himself and his children. A few weeks later, I repainted the hallway in a color my mother had always refused to allow. Every morning now, I make myself a cup of coffee and sit at that same kitchen table. Sometimes I let it grow cold before taking the first sip. Not because I've forgotten what happened, but because every quiet morning reminds me how far I've come. Real strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's choosing to stay calm, standing your ground, and letting the truth speak for itself until no one can ignore it anymore. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to subscribe. Every week, we share powerful stories about ordinary people who quietly found the courage to stand up for themselves and change their lives without wasting a single unnecessary word.